Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today it's the final year-end list, the top 50 best albums of 2020. You know, there's a part of me that wants to give more of an explanation as to why this is a little bit late. And then there's a part of me that wants to say, look, if you watched On the Pulse for the past year or so and saw just how many albums that I covered, you would get it at this point. And you know, that's arguably the biggest new factor surrounding my year-end list of the best albums of 2020. Normally, this is the one that feels the easiest for me to assemble. I will track everything that I listen to throughout the year. I maintain my own personal list of where I would rank respective projects, and I update it frequently. And hell, I already turned in my list of my top 10 albums of 2020 to Uproxx damn near a month and a half ago. This should not have been all that strenuous for me to put together. And you know what? That would all be a pretty fair assessment, even in 2020, except this year. I reviewed over 370 albums in On the Pulse, and that's more than an album a day. Now, some of that will be changing in 2021. My last video discussed why and some of those plans for the near future. Go back and check it out if you haven't. But look, when you cover that much material where you could credibly make a top 50 list and still have to make some painful cuts, it kind of feels like a disservice to all the work I did to not finish the job appropriately, especially when chopping it down to just a top 25 would leave off so much that deserves all the more attention, especially coming out of the underground and especially in 2020 with the platform I have. And that is the other thing that I would really want to stress here. Especially in the lower half of this list, I would not put that much weight in any rankings I may have assigned, especially as all these albums are legit great and they deserve all the exposure and attention that I can provide. And I flip-flopped on where I would sequence any of them multiple times throughout a listen to this entire list. And you know, the other very big reason why this took so goddamn long to get out, there's a lot of albums here. Hell, there was a part of me that just wanted to follow Bandcamp's lead and scrap any sort of ranking system altogether. Placing any of this into an arbitrary, time-locked hierarchy where the argument becomes a lot less about the subjective and the unique emotional experience that I might have had with this art and more about numbers and status. Let's be real, it's pedantic. It reinforces the delusion that there's such a thing as objective standards of criticism. And let's be real, it does artists, it does critics, and it even does my audience no favors here. The only reason that a ranking exists, it's for my own personal records at this specific moment in time. It could change in a month or two, and as time has proven, again, it can shift and change as I evolve and change as a critic and as a listener. So if anything, this list might serve more as a task for all of you. I can damn near guarantee that none of you heard every single album on this list, all with their own unique little eccentricities and entanglements, and you know, maybe it'll give you the drive to check a couple of them out. Perhaps starting off with...
Fuck the war stories, hideous soul glory. You tell them how you did, shorty? Nah, never that, never that. It was all just a nest of rats, a nest of rats. It was all just a nest of rats.
This is an album all about capturing and trying to measure the value of little victories, the incremental steps to actually build away from the apocalypse they've often foretold, all against production that is brighter and cleaner than ever from this group, and bars that feel all the more tangled and abstract. Arm & Hammer might have found even thornier obfuscations in their path here, but you know what? It's one that for once, it leads to hope. Might have been a tough album to approach, but I went back to it. I appreciate it.
Come on inside with me, join the family.
Bill Callahan finds some unstable multitudes within himself on this project that's more scattered and funny than he's been in years, mostly coming through looking outside of himself with some degree of bemusement as he tries to take stock of time's passage and wind the next steps of his artistic journey. He might be a fair bit more settled and setting into his ways, but those ways, they're ever moving, and this album, all the benefit for it.
Everybody gotta eat, not everybody gotta breathe. But for now, nobody move, nobody bleed. Honestly, nobody chew, nobody sneeze. Before you hit the door, we gonna leave with what we need.
Now this is a jagged team-up and debut from a pair of abstract bruisers from the underground who are delivering some ruthless and cutting bars. The sort of grimy, old-school underground rap that's littered with references as they brood and sift through the wreckage. Definitely a pretty intense and harrowing listen, but it's rewarding to crack through every layer. This one got slept on by a lot of people, even those in the know. You'll want to hear it. I see everyone who put the Fontaines DC and Proto-Martyr albums on their year-end list instead of this, which is blisteringly noisy with pummeling grooves, a brand of post-punk that's as deliriously horny as it is relentlessly charged and political, a howling voice from the street being broken to be gentrified. Look, I see you. And it's not a voice that's gonna come quietly, nor should it.
Hakeem to Yasin, I'm in Casco Bay, Casca with me. Staying at the Hotel Scallops room, February 3rd. Whisper singing Nelly Furtado, wishing I was a yard bird.
The street poet who gets kicked out of the reading continues in his abstract musings over a spacious cushion of jazzy production from the Jefferson Park Boys and Kenny Siegel. Where at R.A.P. Ferreira, he can seal himself in his own well-constructed house of mirrors with an ascetic commitment to a lot of the spoken word artifice so that he can deliver so well. And when the vibes and musings are this potent, one really has to acknowledge that it is so artfully done. This is another good sleeper. You'll want to hear it. Yeah, it might be their most direct and clunky album to date. The sign that idols might be starting to believe their own mimetic hype a little bit too much, that the nuance starts sliding out of the frame. But let's be real, it's not like they're often wrong. And they're at least self-aware enough to realize that this sort of straightforward, percussive catharsis can be the most immediate relief. And again, some songs like Model Village just fucking slay. You'll want to hear it.
Your lucky penny, you can be my four-leaf clover, starting over.
Yeah, okay, probably his best. A little long and a little short on distinctive ideas to justify his length, but Dave Cobb finally gave Chris Stapleton the textured mixes to back up his full-throated delivery, and the results wind up with such high quality, it is hard to complain. Also following his most political moments to date, and a sign that the album's title might be the chit in Nashville that he's catching in. So, I think it might be more transitional. I want to see where he's going next. The bliss of facing and accepting one's primal end, burning through false histories to accept the wild tranquility within, all amidst the most organic fusion of acoustic elements and atmospheric black metal since probably Panopticon. An unexpected gem out of Brazil. This is a rainforest taking back the world that would burn it, and yeah, I really sunk into that vibe.
That a loved one might return and speak to you, even though he wanted it to be true.
Everyone who told me that Bob Dylan's layered writing excused some haphazard delivery and some really questionable production, they need to put this album on and then take a seat. It's some stunning indie country and singer-songwriter material from a wily old master who is just as funny, heartfelt, and pensive in contemplating his legacy and the great white beast of time ahead, especially for all those whose stories might wind up a little bit voiceless. It's got that populism that I really like. This is another underrated gem. You'll want to dig it up.
The Balladeer waits in the wings, tugging on a dress, tuning her strings. All the whiskey faded, cigarette blown dreams.
Digging deeper into some maternal themes with diminishing returns, unless you're of that age where it'll absolutely hit more deeply, but it's arguably some of the most layered and robust arrangements that Dave Cobb has ever given her. It is not Lori McKenna's best by any stretch, but when her best highlight one of the greatest songwriters working today in any genre, it is kind of hard to ignore that she's still bringing greatness here, and there are moments in which this is still a treat.
I sit on sandbox love.
Oh, are you surprised to see this? You shouldn't be. It's her best album, arguably since the 90s, with a sharp confessional honesty that fits her idiosyncratic writing and raw delivery like a glove, where age has allowed her edges to gleam and expose the exhausted but vibrant humanity within. And you know, if the production had just been a little bit more consistent, this could have rivaled Fiona Apple for women who are long intentionally misunderstood, returning to drive forth some real raw truth. And even then, this was slept on, and still something really special.
There's one big old reason why I'm even leaving at all. It's that asphalt, that sweet asphalt.
Oh look, in one fell swoop, Dierks Bentley made a wickedly sharp and targeted parody that also just so happens to be one of the best neo-traditional country albums that was released in 2020. More proof that if Nashville just got out of his goddamn way, he would be one of the most interesting, mainstream accessible acts on Music Row. Yes, it might be incredibly niche for someone who grew up on this stuff, but it's certainly a niche I can get behind. In more ways than one. Don't think about that too hard.
As a reminder, we've yet to find it. Well, where is that disappearing girl?
One of the most fully formed indie country debuts I've heard in a long time. Juliet McConkey came out of nowhere with her spare brand of slow burn songs, telling stories of women who are often used and abused by the modern world, but also digging into the uncomfortable systemic and emotional complexities that might enable all of it. It's an unassumingly tough listen, but one very much worth hearing, and a woman I really hope we don't find disappearing, because the potential on display, something special.
If you really know me now, ain't no need to throw me out. I just be here on my cloud, ain't no point in coming down. If you really know me now, ain't no need to throw me out. I just be here on my cloud, ain't no point in coming down.
Alright, the production doesn't quite have the huge dramatic flair of the first Marlowe album, but Solomon Brigham tightened up both his content and a lot of his lyrical dexterity to deliver a terrifically fun and criminally underrated set of songs here, a balancing act with L'Orange that is once again executed impeccably well. It's weirdly comforting as a listen, mostly through finding comfort in weirdness, but the hustle, the flow, undeniable. Again, this is underrated. You'll want to hear it. So I had to review this triple album at length in its own distinctive piece, and I had way more to say that can be summarized in a pithy fragment here, so I will stick with this. Patricia Taxxon, she took the full, many-colored breadth of her explorations into electronic music, from bro step to a lot of hyperpop to ambient, and then she made a postmodern blur that crosses gender, shape, apocalypse, and her own artistic drive. It's wonderfully dense, but incessantly melodic and catchy. It's a dance towards transcendence. I just hope it keeps on flying.
But then I pass the last place I saw you alive.
So the Mountain Goats went a little bit feral in 2020, especially on this album, but in a world where what is once pristine is decaying and what is decaying is being overgrown towards renewal, it is a bit of a nice touch to see the Mountain Goats actually explore some of that, and everyone willing to plumb into some of those depths, whatever the cost of their sanity might be. But with this remarkable amount of accessible, upbeat charm, John Darnielle actually managed to make his shambling singer-songwriter project just unearth so many nuggets of gold with every single tentative step into that wilderness. And again, it's accessible, a little fragmented, but it needs to be on this journey.
Face down. Ass up, face down, ass up to the ground. Monastery, chicken head, bust a juke, hit the chick, cabbage patch.
One of the most blissful rap albums of 2020, Chris Keys returns to give Quelle Chris's pensive reflections on a wider world and his newfound place of modern success in its smoothest and jazziest foundations he has ever had. A lush but modest and thoughtful meander through a lot of terrific guest verses, to say nothing of Quelle Chris's own content, and while it can feel a little bit unstructured, it also feels like it's his most sober and mature work to date. Solid, innocent meditation indeed. Rina Sawayama delivered a full-length debut that takes the nostalgic blur of a half dozen early 2000s sounds and then infuses them with some righteous intensity, reflecting on claiming her own unique place in art, finding her true roots, and then filling up some of the emptiness of her past with some truly charged and forward-thinking societal commentary for yet another layer of subversion. And as pop metal begins to slide back into popularity once again, Rina Sawayama proves more than capable of leading that charge. And I'm happy she's doing so.
I fuck with black magic, yeah. I fuck with black magic, yeah. I love the bad magic, yeah. I love the bad magic, yeah. Fuck with the mathematics, yeah. Fuck with the mathematics, yeah. I fuck with bad habits, yeah. I fuck with bad habits.
She needs less than a half hour to decompress the tangled horrors of depression and oppression, family rejection, and an existential nightmare into a better produced and more punishing set of bangers than leave pretty much all of her cis counterparts in trap metal scrambling here. What Backwash proved with this project, it wasn't just a textured and nuanced understanding of all the occult trappings behind her art, but also the compositional chops to really bring them to bear, with a core of earnest humanity that allows you to care beyond the shock value. Also, it just bangs like you would not believe, but let's be real, that goes without saying. Oh wow, and this grindcore hardcore punk act, they need even less time to just break you apart. 15 minutes that can only be described as punishing, with melodic grooves that are so ugly, so gargantuan, and they seem so wild, you almost don't even notice how razor tight some of the compositions and the insanely visceral writing is. The sort of tightly contained nightmare that bulldozes everything in its path. Yeah, you should move, or you'll get trod under.
Can I get a ride? Can I get a ride? Daddy's got the gun. Daddy's got the gun tonight.
Okay, no, it's not better than Real, but a year or 4 away from that painful immediacy actually gave Lydia Loveless the space to spiral out and dig into the roots of all of it. If it feels circular in its gleaming, nocturnal, Fleetwood Mac-esque melodies and compositions, it's kind of because Lydia Loveless needed that therapeutic focus to shade her own passionate ambition. It's an album that knows that she loves too hard, but also provides the path to roll forward into that idea. She might have highlighted that he made it seem real, but now Lydia Loveless can put her own words to that dream and realize it.
Ain't really seen land in a minute.
If there was a rapper who is better suited to the wild anxiety of our times who is not named Billy Woods, I'm not sure I could name him. But Aesop Rock's spiraling eye for survivalist detail and his own brutal frankness for endings, including his own, means that every off-kilter note and paranoid spirit gets memorialized here, especially as he's let the surly darkness in many a time, and he can ride out that lifelong endurance trial. Again, a little overlong and occasionally questionable in some of the detours and the production, as you would expect for something like this, but projects like this are also built to go down rabbit holes, leaving you kicking at turtles all the way down.
They say sing your song, boy, shut your mouth. But I believe in a better South.
An album this divided against itself in sound and content should not hold together. It's more stately and atmospheric and yearning, but also hardscrabble and rootsy and defiantly country. An album that wants to uphold a very strong core of populism, but if only because being this broken and flawed has you clinging to any sort of foundation, and that could be it. A few steps removed from their best, as you can definitely tell that BJ Barham hasn't quite found the core of his sound or ideals in this form just yet, but the struggle to think bigger with real sobriety gives it a raw honesty unlike anything else this year. Occasionally for the worse, but with eyes on their better. Again, not their best, but when said best are classics of indie country of the past decade or so, greatness here still worth highlighting.
I can get by the days just fine, but the nights I sit alone and wonder why. They say the boys don't cry.
This is a new wave comeback for the ages. Neon Trees delivering their best album since Habits, and likely their most fully defined and expansive. 6 years and a really bad breakup gives Tyler Glenn all the ammunition he needs to stave off some of that existential emptiness, and all the hooks he needs to ride the wave as long as he possibly can. Coupled with some razor-tight compositions on a really crisp album package, this is Neon Trees finding the core of their splashy Technicolor attitude, and then giving it enough hydrogen to really explode. Again, sorely overlooked, but a riotously good time. If you haven't heard it, you'll have fun with it. Oh yes, they finally got the drums right, and they made their best album to date. Zonaga's fusion of atmospheric black metal and folk, it took them into territory that owed a little bit less to Celtic melodies and more to a deeper set of American roots, infused with a sacred feminine presence, and frankly, a lot of their best tunes to date. And finally realizing some of that potential, their savagery picked up the infectious focus and tempestuous energy that almost feels like a Chinook coming in down off the mountains. A thunderstorm that's really worth riding. Alright, that is the first 25. Hopefully that didn't take all that long, and I gave you all plenty of material to check out now. So now on to the second half of our list, number 25. So this is probably the most conventional rap album on my list in terms of the content and the grooves and a lot of the presentation. And my general rule of thumb when it comes to some of these is that it really needs to have the refinement in order to stand out in its own lane, or maybe a little bit more to give it that necessary push, put it over the top. And while this is not his best, oh man, going back to Freddie Gibbs, it's rarely been easier than this.
Hey yo, scamming niggas maxing out, ratchet bitches acting out. God made me sell crack, so I had something to rap about.
So there's a part of me that's been willing to be patient for Pinata Part 2, of which Bandana unfortunately fell short for me, but Alfredo stands as a close second, as a phenomenally relaxed and approachable synthesis of Freddie Gibbs's tight gangster rap flows, a lot of his mature stylism, and enough hard life that's been lived to give his material that added detail and texture. It also helps that he's pretty loose and funny when he really needs to be, and all his guest stars really deliver verses that can match that whole vibe. The maturity coming from both Rick Ross and Conway, it was very welcome, but the nicest surprise for me was actually Tyler the Creator, who flips in a luxurious brag with just enough wit that you know that mischievous air is still very there. All against some sample-rich production from Alchemist, which is just so buttery and smooth, but can still knock. In 2020, we all needed an exhale, and I didn't expect it would come from Freddie Gibbs, but I'm kinda happy it did. This was great stuff. Number 24. So there is such a thing as stacking the deck when it comes to an album where you can really look at the producers and the collaborators and just think, okay, I'm gonna love this. And while some might think that would short circuit your critical faculties, more often than not, I'm gonna go in with a goddamn microscope. I'm gonna be going with higher standards, and normally I just wind up disappointed when I see those massive collaborations. Of course, there are exceptions. This might be the best thing the Killers have released since Sam's Town, and if some of the kinks had been fixed, this could have wound up as their best album. Recruiting folks from behind the war on drugs, along with Katie Lang and Wiseblood, this was set up to be the sort of grand indie rock swing for the fences, and more often than not, it actually stuck the landing, courtesy of all those huge hooks and mid-80s inspired Americana that hits all the band's gloriously self-serious ambition. It's cheesy, but it leans into it and it works. And yeah, the production's pretty far from their best. And I did think that minus the sly self-awareness of an Alex Cameron type, that the writing got a little bit less interesting. But when the hooks hit with such an epic organic swell, it was really hard to complain. Coupled with some of their best ever songs and a surprising amount of consistency all the way through, which the Killers have rarely had. Yeah, they made a comeback that I don't think anybody saw coming. And I was just thrilled to ride it. Number 23. So this was also a comeback, so to speak, but I think the buzz around this album got a little bit warped because the band broke up, and then they got back together, they reformed, and then they changed genres along the way, all of which led to a sophomore concept album that triggered just as many questions as answers.
She is a woman, Mary. She is a woman, Mary.
Honest to God, I think I might like this more than Eternity in Your Arms. Yes, it's considerably less punk, and it's embracing more retro glam rock, but before a band as nakedly camp and theatrical as Creeper has always been, I love the sonic experimentation and the more obvious ambition here. Hell, if they had fixed some of the production issues so the shoestring budget wasn't so nakedly obvious across this thing, it could have easily contended for the best of 2020. It was that gloriously ridiculous, and I had that much fun with it. Now granted, it's also moving into territory where I might have to compare Creeper to an act like Kyle Kraft, and I'm not really sure at all they can measure up to him in terms of the writing or production just yet, but I also really appreciate the risk and romanticism of this push, and ultimately how they found just enough to tie things together. Coming out of this black rain, this was a blast from the midnight sun. You probably didn't hear it, you should have. Number 22. But you know, while we're talking about nighttime albums,
Turn the lights down, we can watch the stars crawl. You and I fall, baby, when the night falls.
one of the earliest projects of 2020, and it was criminally slept on because their label had no earthly clue surrounding what a good single was, so I'm not sure if this is Little Big Town's best album, but it's certainly one of their most mature and well-executed projects. This was a year where a lot of folks fell in love again with the smoother, soft rock grooves of Fleetwood Mac, so of course it makes sense that Little Big Town's mixed gender harmonies and a lot of their well-blended acoustic layering, it would make them obvious winners this year if anybody had bothered to hear them. But where I saw the greatest leap forward into that territory came in the songwriting. This was an album that feels like it came from a band that were in their 40s, who have lived a lot of life and had to have made some morally ambiguous and complicated decisions about their relationships. And you know, if wine, beer, whiskey was not on this thing, this would have been one of the years of best surprises and real standouts. Mainstream Nashville might have completely mishandled and forgotten forgotten about this band, but they deserve better attention than they got this year. The deep cuts are something special. If you haven't heard it, dig it up. Number 21. And you know, given that we're already in this territory of overlooked projects due to Nashville mismanagement,
Damn you for breaking my heart. Damn you for breaking my heart.
I've said it before, I'll say it again. Caitlin Smith should be one of the biggest pop country artists of the modern era, and at this point, folks are out of excuses as to why she isn't. No, the album is not as textured or diverse as her debut, Starfire, and the reverb-saturated production kind of reminded me a little bit too much of certain indie trends in the 2010s that got played out. But you know what? When the compositions are so sharp in their melody and content, paired with a singer who actually has the pipes to match mixes of this size, Caitlin Smith can match the title of her project for just sheer power. An album of complicated heartbreak and renewal that balances out nuance with some real righteous catharsis. It might feel a little bit more single-minded than her debut, but throughout 2020, no less effective for it. This woman should be a goddamn superstar in the same vein as Florence Welch, of that era, of that type in modern pop country. Anytime Nashville could make that happen, it would be swell. Just saying. Number 20. You know, sometimes you just have to let things be what they are. So let's deal with this.
Right, I can't stay forever. Let's play pretend and treat this night like it'll happen again. You'll be my bloody Valentine tonight.
Look, I know. It's stupid, it's overcompressed, it's relentlessly cliched, it's a mess. And have I mentioned that it's stupid yet? So why does it work so goddamn well? Because there's a part of me that says this works in spite of Machine Gun Kelly, where he's just such a dumbass stumbling through great hooks and Travis Barker giving him the most propulsive grooves and production really of his entire career. But then you actually realize the stupidity is kind of why this works as well as it does. For so many people claiming that this is derivative, I don't know. I don't think many acts could have sacrificed their dignity to make an album like this, given that it rides so heavily on Machine Gun Kelly's personality, which can be kind of a tough pill to swallow. I've compared this a fair bit to I Get Wet by Andrew WK in mining epic magic out of the raw, dumb basics, but there's honestly even less airs and pretension to it. I don't need to make those excuses. So you're never gonna take it all that seriously, and when the majority of the album shows Machine Gun Kelly stumbling through bad melodrama, you realize you can very easily treat it with the thickest veneer of irony for just cheap disposability. You have it for 1 year, it's gone the next. But let's be real, I don't see that veneer, and there's a part of me that kind of likes this because of how honest it is in its stupidity, especially when the hooks are great and the album can really lean into it, where even some of the sincere moments actually kind of work. Yeah, you might call it derivative, but not only did most pop punk in 2020 not have hooks or grooves as good as this, trust me, I reviewed a lot of it, but also there is some uniqueness coming from the pulse from modern emo rap, which sonically fits a similar family, even as it all feels desperate as hell. And you know what? I think desperate might be the most appropriate word here. One self-aware, low-cunning calculation, probably from his management, to get into this genre after getting driven out of rap, and he managed to strike gold for one album. I don't expect it to last. I get why purists of multiple genres and a lot of critics will hate this album or can't connect with it to have any fun. And I'll be real here, I don't think Machine Gun Kelly can probably pull this off twice, and I'm not sure a legion of imitators will either. But I had more fun with this album in 2020 than I think anybody could have predicted, and I think it works, even if I can still see that downfall on the horizon. Number 19. Okay, that was a lot. Let's take a deep breath. pick up something a little bit less controversial, shall we?
Cause I got you sprung off in the springtime. Fuck all your free time. You don't need no me time. That's you and me time. We be getting so loud. That dick make my soul smile. That dick made me so damn proud.
Well, okay, that assessment depends on the circles that you're in. If you float around a lot of spaces that talk about R&B, I've seen folks come down pretty hard on Jhené Aiko's newest album for being her most upbeat, commercially accessible, or even lightweight album to date. The sort of project where it will surprise you at first that it was nominated for a Grammy, and then you realize looking at the track list that it just makes way too much sense. But honestly, Jhené Aiko choosing to write more hooks while still maintaining her unassailable, low-key charisma and power alongside a lot of liquid, organic production and one hell of a consistent vibe, it only serves to highlight a lot of her influences in modern R&B, especially as this project can be as thematically robust if you start looking in between the lines, falling in love yet again, but also having a very jaded and melancholic approach to all of it, counting just how many days it will really last. There is a blissful wistfulness that I just find so really damn compelling here, and even if it's not trying to be as literate as Sold Out or as expansive as Trip was, this is another slice of R&B where Jhené Aiko proves just how special and criminally underrated she is, and that's why this is on this list. Number 18. But you know, while we're in the territory of criminally underrated artists,
The other side, ain't it cold on the other side? The other side, now it's you on the other side.
okay, I get why some of you might be a bit surprised to see this one, because I imagine a whole bunch of you didn't even know this came out, even though I reviewed it in On the Pulse, given that its best singles were dropped when she was on a different label mismanaging her career, and she put this out among a week that was full of utter insanity, IRL. But when I first reviewed Cam back in 2015, I was just convinced that she had the pop chops and personality to make a colorful and diverse pop country album, and the other side, it is that in spades. It's the leap forward with better writing, a lot more refined production, and some of the best hooks that she has ever had, marshalling a slew of collaborators and co-writers like Lori McKenna and even Harry Styles, but never having their voices overwhelm her own magnetic presence and personality. This is the sort of album that fulfills all the promise that came on Untamed back in 2015 and then some. And you know what? Even if Nashville somehow doesn't know what to do with her, Cam is still a force to be reckoned with. I'll say it again, you probably missed this album. You should fix that. Number 17. Okay, this was a project I found practically by accident. It was from a YouTube comment that suggested it. I had a slow week. I had seen a little bit of buzz circling around it, but nothing substantial. But I was looking for a little bit of country that week, especially on the poppier side. And it was her debut album, so not a lot of work to go into. So why not give it a chance?
She's the anchor that is keeping me sound. Oh, my mind's a ship that's going down.
I'll say it, it's a ballsy move to call your album Expectations. I can count at least 2 albums in recent years with that same name that fell really short, but Katie Pruitt showed just how much of a defined presence and sound she could bring to the table. The atmosphere was so gorgeous, leaning into traces of dream country, but with a lot more supple touches in the arranged orchestration, especially the strings, that called back to the smokier sides that maybe even came out of indie pop. And not only could Katie Pruitt really command and sell the atmosphere with her distinctive huskier vocal tones, but also deliver a set of very queer love stories. Really, for the ages, they were really distinct. This is an album that is drenched in a blend of Catholic boarding school austerity that was juxtaposed with some low-key millennial narratives of coming out in its defiance of that system. An album that's coaxed through love-struck adolescence, but with the real maturity to see the bigger picture and the emotive nuance, but also the spirit to charge forth regardless and really own it. Arguably one of the biggest surprises of 2020, and one of country's most stark starkly effective political statements in 2020, mostly just by living it. And I gotta respect that. Number 16. So yeah, we aren't gonna get away from politics for the next couple of entries, and I'm not particularly interested in your objections to that. The comments are down there. Have fun, but also be very conscious of what discourse you want to start in these times. But in this case, it is a tougher and more nuanced conversation, because I don't think I've ever heard an album that is quite like this.
The earth is radiantly suicidal. Well, the earth is radiantly suicidal. So if there's any play in favor of survival, it's go small.
On simply a sonic level, Seeming defies easy categorization. Post-punk, industrial, dance rock, but more of a theatrical pop focus that's coaxed through more organic instrumentals. There isn't really an easy parallel, either to past or present, to this sound. And when you pair it with politics that skew very far left and survivalist, it's so damn unique that it's kind of hard to categorize. Now, it is far from perfect. The apocalyptic trend line it follows in the content can be a little questionable, especially when some of the production's a bit inconsistent, and that follow-up album that Seeming released just a month later really just felt like a lot of undercooked B-sides. I wanted to like it a lot more. But in a year with so much societal upheaval, Seeming found the spot between anthemic invective and a soothing moment that allows you to catch your breath, which really best comes from somebody who actually knows the mental and physical strain that comes with protest. It's organic but theatrical, amazingly quotable, but also just groovy and dance-worthy as hell. It's an album that is difficult to describe and will likely not be for everyone. We're really just outside of a small niche, except for those for whom it was everything they needed. Because we're in this for the long haul. Long haul indeed. Number 15. Yeah, we're staying in sharply organic, politically charged material for a bit. And I swear, they just keep getting better, don't they?
If the body hurts, see the body gone. So who body make up for all the wrongs done to bodies? They keep singing they songs while your body rot. Well, fuck it, come on, they gotta pay.
At this point, I'm not sure how I would rank Clipping's albums, because even within the context of their respective years, they are just so diverse and robust in their compositions and subject matter that, frankly, it becomes damn near impossible, especially when a project like this picks up so much primal energy that is just so unique. The self-titled project might be more immediately accessible, and probably still has my favorite song from them, but the sheer expanse of the soundcraft and the production and pulling together the shambling horrorcore nightmare on display doesn't just show a group with an impressive amount of genre knowledge in horror itself, but also very much know how to dig into the dripping, gory underbelly of the black societal commentary, which translates to both the text and the subtext, all the while keenly aware of the grand metatextual experience and commentary that any Clipping album and its commentary on hip-hop will have, and I still loved it. Coupled with Davi Diggs, who's just running circles around every pier yet again, and the album's seismic, apocalyptic, experimental feel. Well, apocalypse in Greek can be roughly translated to the revealing of knowledge. And what Clipping has unleashed? Revelations indeed. Number 14. But you know, while we're on the topic of revelations, see, the odd thing here is that she's been saying it for over 20 years now. And only now it seems like folks are finally ready to listen, or at least listen a little more deeply.
Oh, kick me under the table all you want. I won't shut up. I won't shut up. Kick me under the table all you want. I won't shut up.
It's the most critically beloved album of 2020, and yeah, I get why. Fiona Apple's swirling, percussive, jazz-inflected rock music shudders and quakes with some complicated rage. The sort of material that's held together more on force of will than any sort of conventional structure. And that makes a lot of sense. Fetch the Bolt Cutters, it's straining to break free at damn near every single angle. Apropos for the year, a torrent of emotion society demands that women stifle, but where Fiona Apple has clearly run out of all fucks to give, but she's also very mature and thoughtful enough to understand that her unique tempest will not be shared by everyone, men or women, and it makes for one hell of a daring and fascinating singer-songwriter album. I mentioned in my solo review that this reminded me plenty of times of Nico Case's Hell On, but in the months since, I've realized that this album echoes many of the veneers Fiona Apple had on her first two albums, torn away now in 2020 in a refusal to play the game in her most raw work to date. I'm not sure it holds together as well as said earlier work, which I still think is her best, but I'm also certain she really doesn't care a whit about my judgment one way or the other. Glad to see that folks are finally listening, and they see that potential realized. Number 13. But on the topic of potential realized, and for a bit of a wild pivot here,
you left me with nothing, not like any other stranger. But why do I think of you? You left me with nothing, not looking in the eyes of a stranger. Just trying to get over you.
Okay, look, everyone in the mainstream spent their year fawning over Harry Styles, and I get it. He's the bigger personality, he's the one with hits and a public figure, but Niall Horan proved on Heartbreak Weather that not only could he make better pop rock among all of his immediate peers, he could also go toe-to-toe with some of the heavyweights in his scene like the 1975 and even Ed Sheeran, adapting the roots of their sound and frankly just doing it better. The key word here, craftsmanship. He's not reinventing the wheel with this particular breakup album or shattering any sense of norms in his melodies or production, but that's because of the level of emotional heft, maturity, and sheer charisma that he brings to the table, combined with hooks for days he doesn't need to. Niall Horan proves he will not be the flashiest, but he'll definitely be one of the smartest and coolest guys in the room, and for this sort of pop, it works. And frankly, I still think there's room for improvement. The production can be tightened up in spots, a little bit more refinement there. The rollout plan for this album could have been greatly improved. And frankly, he's just a half step away from being a superstar. And hell, somehow I wound up on this train early. And thus far, I'm real damn happy to stay on board, especially when the weather's like this. Number 12. Okay, I mentioned this a while back that I like rooting for the B-listers. The folks for where you can tell it's not effortless, where you don't have the top spot by birthright, where you gotta work outside the box a little bit, take some risks, be maybe even a little bit more desperate to get to the top, and you might not even get there. And while I wouldn't say this is desperate by any means, I can hear the risk behind making this album, but you can also tell this is the album that Brett Eldredge has always wanted to make. And it's his best.
It's gonna be a good day. I don't know why, but it feels like love's coming my way. And the sun ain't even shining.
If there's an album I sorely regret that I didn't review in full, if only just to give it more attention, it's probably this one. Because Brett Eldredge took the sort of artistic leap that in a just world would have made him one of Nashville's biggest acts on this project, and it turned out so well. An old-fashioned crooner sensibility, dabbling with some convincing blue-eyed soul and hints of dream country in the production, while still keeping the richness of his baritone on an impeccably produced project. It just sounds so good. The first point where his unique combination of influences really came together and actually really rose above his loose status as the funny company man. And you know, if it was just the stylism, that would be one thing. Still remarkable, but just one thing. But Brett Eldredge wrote the majority of this album too. And all the promise that so many of us saw from his earliest days finally returned, and then some. And if you've seen my year-end list of the best songs of 2020, you also know just how many entries he placed on that list, including 2 extremely high. And if it wasn't just for a little bit of flabbing spots, this would be the best album that mainstream Nashville has seen in years. As it is, yeah, still up there, and worth all the more attention. Number 11. Honestly, I could just repeat what I said at the mid-year, because if anything, it's all the more true now. This is an album that might slip out of your mind when you hear it, even afterwards, a couple months later, you wonder why you praised it so much, and then you put it on, and you just couldn't imagine it any other way.
So I could care less on a night like this. I'm on the lookout for anything that moves Crimson Tide.
The truth with this album is that you can't really get it if you didn't get Ken 3 years ago, where Dan Behar takes his haunted, synthwave, singer-songwriter observations to how artists will react specifically to apocalyptic scenarios and the world-shaking rise of authoritarianism, and that was the prequel, where it was a lot more anxious fear and paralyzed dread that came on Ken, and it was a little unapproachable. It was not for everyone. Have We Met is far more immediate. It moves up the timetable. And while the writing remains kind of oblique and how Dan Behar struggles to find the right words to build as many meaningful connections as he can as everything crumbles around him, the production, it's much more in your face. It's more driving. The grooves are way stronger, as it kind of needs to be to have that immediacy. More than ever, it's an album that forces artists to reconcile the power of their voices and their craft and their platform. You don't get to wallow in angst anymore, even if you might want to. And that makes an album that on the surface might kind of seem perfect for a lot of brooding or escape, and makes it all the more galvanizing. Again, this dropped very early in 2020, pre-pandemic for the majority of us, wound up being slept on by too many throughout the year, and yet somehow, it only becomes more relevant. Number 10. There's a part of me that wants to explain how this happened. That part of me was defeated by the desire just to throw everyone to the winds and for y'all to hear it just like I did. So 2020 was a year I apparently got into Screamo, which as a genre maybe had a really strong year or something, close to a revival. I don't know how true that is, but the first time I heard the Russian band Bagdadsky Vor and their debut album here, I found myself kind of spellbound. Even though all the lyrics are in Russian, the melodies were so bright, so spellbinding that in balancing out the bliss with ferocious energy, I got the same sort of euphoria I get with the best of black metal that I really like. On tunes alone, this could have made the list, but then I actually translated the lyrics and the content, and I found the sort of fiercely revolutionary material that had to have been a risk to release in Russia, not just for how it grounds itself against the rampant corruption of the authoritarian establishment that runs things over there, but also how it sees a shining way out of all of it. It's ultimately optimistic. It's Screamo with a healthy side of hope. As wildly catchy as anything else you would hear in this subgenre this year, a primal scream that, again, feels way too relevant. I mean, it would have been great outside of that, though. You likely did not hear this album either, and even for folks who are not into Screamo, as I wasn't before this year, definitely worth hearing. Again, check it out. Number 9. So I caught this one late, and it's honestly the sort of project where it's tough to say that much about it, other than, yeah, the follow-up might be 5 years late, but it's so goddamn welcome that we got it.
'Cause I fooled them all right into thinking that I'm worth a damn. So nobody knows what a nobody I am.
Ward Davis has been a name I've seen floating around specific indie country spheres for a while now, more known for his writing chops than his own projects, but if there is an album that can correct that assumption, it's probably this one, hitting the expert balance between scuzzy, intensely detailed, and visceral southern rock, and more neo-traditional country that might be a little bit more approachable. Ward Davis manages to write one hell of a complicated but genuinely gripping divorce album along the way, many of the songs finding that sad sweet spot between anger, a lot of numbness and grief, and the complexity to know that it's not really anybody's explicit fault. And if it is, he is as much to blame. It's country that wants to hold itself to a higher standard with a lot of powerful honesty, whereas very low-key delivery is as much of a boon as emphasizing some of that sense of grounded populism that comes in the writing. And when the songs overall are this consistently great, it feels like he delivered all the promise that Cody Jinks has kind of been sitting on the past decade or so, if not more. Now, I will say I did miss the harmonica a little bit, but outside of that, this is plain-spoken, Jason Eady-esque grown man country, and it is absolutely worth a lot more attention beyond just the scene. Again, you probably didn't hear it. You should have. Number 8. So going back to Screamo for a bit, you might notice that I said Screamo had a particularly strong year, as far as I've been told, and normally I would have to provide more evidence beyond some random Russian band's debut album. So what would happen if you take a Screamo act and then give them the sweeping, punishing power of atmospheric black metal, and then content that's just as visceral to match it? Yeah, in recent years, there's usually that one black metal album that gets into my top 10 where I can just point to the melodic swells and the crescendo and the production that gives it so much righteous power. As a band, they really don't have to do that much more, but Svalbard, they went further. Their lead singers delivered some throat-shredding screams, and the lyrics, they were all about tearing free and tearing down those societal barriers to expose some real trauma, specifically accentuated by just how well Serena Cherry balanced out her screams with her clean singing. And yeah, it gets visceral, it gets very raw, extremely fast, but it's the clarity that comes with letting a wound bleed freely, a purification that lets you reclaim your agency and your self-worth. And even then, some of the poetry across this project is just so genuinely striking. The sort that's just a natural complement to the balance of serenity and savagery that both black metal and Screamo share. And yeah, this is another considerable improvement from their previous projects, and Svalbard, they managed to find a synthesis of their sound, and they made it glorious. Another oft-overlooked project, they're all over this list, and those even outside of Screamo and black metal, you should hear it. Number 7. So the next 4 albums on my list, I'm not going to say they're repeats, but by sheer happenstance, the last albums that they all put out were in 2017, and they also all made my top 10 that year. I don't know what to tell you. They're some of the best acts of the past decade, and I'm just going to highlight that. Ergo, you should already know why I really love these artists. My challenge is convincing you why these albums specifically are special in their own ways. So let's start with Another Moment of Bliss.
You know it's been such a long, long time without you.
One thing I have found tremendously rewarding about getting into Perfume Genius is that you can actively hear the arc of their content and healing of Mike Hadrius. And while finding his bliss has certainly been a bit of an odd moment, especially this year, I can't deny just how tremendously relieving it felt to indulge in it. Not quite as decadent as a lot of the escapism on No Shape, but it doesn't need to be this time around. He's more secure in himself and his relationships. His eyes are clearer, and even some of the body dysmorphia that has racked him before seems at least a little bit more controlled and balanced on this album. And that is a weight I am thrilled to hear him lift within that larger context. And as such, the album does not reach the glorious points of swelling decadence that made No Shape so magical to go back to, but in a sense finding normalcy and stability gives this album a different sort of core that's just as relevant, picking up elements of rock and even touches of vintage country, and showing the most diversity in his sound that he has ever had. Every single Perfume Genius is on some level a point of ecstasy. This one just found its organic foundation and is magic for it. Number 6. Whereas, if we're just gonna rip out the foundation altogether, well, okay, come on. You had to hear this coming.
It gets easier, but it never gets easier.
for me especially, on some level this album is easy to praise. Come on, it's Jason Isbell. He's one of the best writers in alternative country. Give him the most expansive production Dave Cobb can deliver, outside of some of his most progressive compositions, you've got an automatic winner here. But I'll admit that Reunions is not an easy album by any stretch of the mind. Most because you can sense the instability, the struggles, both internal and external, that rack it and the artist behind it. Where the Nashville sound saw him confront a lot of the demons he had tried to put behind him, and realization they're always going to be with him. Reunions is where he's forced to look both further outwards and inwards than ever before, towards the deeply held roots of his vices, the insecurities in his relationship, and the roots of a conservative ideology where he looks to attack the very foundational ideals of the entire political movement, challenging not on specific figures or totems or events of the time, but on their sense of morality, and that does cut more deeply. I said that the Nashville sound would probably divide his audience, if not driven off his social media presence, but Reunions, that was the album that really cut to the roots this year. And when you pair it with a sense of uncertain dread that runs through damn near every bit of subtext, every implication across certain moments of this year, it was almost a little bit too anxious to revisit. It was just a bit too much. But Jason Isbell knows enough to allow us to catch a breath. And while I am not sure it matches up with his best in the 2010s, because, again, how could it? It's potent all the same. And again, the fiddle from Amanda Shires. Wow. Number 5. I mean, we're already here when it comes to loaded politics. Let's keep going.
Get it? Look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar. Get it? Look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar. Get it? Look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar. Get it? Look at all these slave masters.
I said when I reviewed RTJ4 that I was concerned how well it would hold up outside of the moments of the uprisings of last summer. I wasn't sure the album held up to the standards of the past two projects, despite trying to capture a lot of the visceral energy and rawness of Run the Jewels 2 and the expansiveness in the production of RTJ3. And going back to it now, I still do agree with that assessment. I also just happen to think it's one of the best rap albums of 2020 because, again, I am comparing it against some impossible standards, and it's not like a lot of the broader societal problems that were highlighted at the roots of this project. It's not like they're going away. More's the pity. And again, we might know what we're getting along the way here. It's Run the Jewels. The production's colorful, immense, and it bangs like you would not believe. LP and Killer Mike are trading even more complex bars that only pick up greater weight and depth. The guest stars, they're all delivering, even 2 Chainz. And while I think the over-the-top stylized banditry can clash with how raw and real the politics have to be in 2020, it is a tonal balancing act that felt shakier than ever before here. They actually do at least seem to get the stakes and the crushingly immense challenges that face them ahead, and where even in taking down the unjust hierarchies and systems, they can't afford a lot of the luxury to be martyrs along the way. And the smartest thing that this album does is show more of that underlying weight, that humanity, that struggle. I mean, they're 4 for 4 people. Hell, with Killer Mike's 2012 album, Rap Music, you could argue they are 5 for 5. That's a run that's damn near unprecedented in hip-hop, even beyond the moment in 2020, and now beyond that moment, they've had a lot of the right words for the right time. Number 4. Now, one thing that I've highlighted along this list is the psychological wear that both these rappers had faced. And I'll admit dealing with some of that weight either through finding your tranquility or spewing forth a flagrant inferno, kind of 2 sides of the same coin on this list in particular. I mean, you needed it in 2020. We all lived through that year. We get why. So when you have an album that's not just going to take you into that territory, but then drag you down every single nightmarish step of the ride.
Lying on the edge of a cliff, watching everything fall down. Lying on the edge of the world, I ain't afraid of anything.
It seems like Open Mike Eagle and I both had some of the worst years of our lives right before the nightmare of 2020, and his way to heal from it was taking us on his unique ride. It's by far his most direct and personal project to date. It's an album that strips away a lot of the deflection and the artifice of intricate wordplay and challenging production of the whole R.A.P label for something that's more lean and a lot more focused. And where Open Mike Eagle is self-aware to a fault, enough to pull back the camera this time around. He does not look nor sound his best on this album, and it doesn't pull punches with every small little awkward step that contributed to everything that was falling apart. But even more so, he doesn't deny himself any culpability that he might have, which if anything, makes it sting all the deeper. And when he retreats into flights of fiction as a divorcee and now a single dad who is on the cusp of a bad midlife crisis, if not already there, where he's all the more acutely aware of how pathetic it might look in comparison with a lot of societal expectations and machismo that he's expected to inhabit, there is a genuine power in how that artifice, both within his culture and outside of it, can give him some real self-care to build his way out. Because he has to. And there's such pathos in doing that work, finding that core, not just with the fact that these might be some of the catchiest and darkly funny moments Open Mike Eagle has had since Hella Personal Film Festival, a project I still think is underrated to this day, but also that he did find some sort of relief by the very end. Or at least he's just gonna keep on trudging and looking forward, maybe probably a blend of the two. This is a definition of the album that will take you on a roller coaster of emotions, and even outside of providing some of that desperately needed escape in October of 2020, it's a ride worth taking, even if by the end you might agree that it's October and you're tired too. Number 3. So I just described that balance between tranquility and rage that populates a lot of my lists, but there is one big exception, one that effectively came out of nowhere to effectively steal my year, and here it is.
Swearing like the captain of the riverboat Queens, hauling all your money down to New Orleans. She got it, heartbreakers smile. Whoa.
Okay, this is gonna sound a little nuts. Please bear with me. I've been thinking this all year. It's a comparison I think works. Gabe Lee feels like the Han Solo of indie country. And then he's a bit of a scoundrel with some rough edges, but he's got so much wry charm and charisma that you wind up looking past it. He's all the better for it, especially when his colorful and varied blend of country is just so warm and appealing to the ear. And yet, what's kind of astounding is that outside of that strong baseline appeal, there might not be much to say about Honky Tonk Hell. Sure, the writing is terrific, and his Dylan-esque rasp picks up some real soul whenever he belts. He's got the pipes for an album like this, and the production just has so much varied character, and he runs through hookups like Dion's The Wanderer, but the fact that there is that buried eye for sympathetic and empathetic detail that tempers his scoundrel side with some genuine heart. This is an album that could have very easily gotten away with the outlaw macho posturing, but the fact that he doesn't really bother leads to more interesting framing and a more distinctive album that became so easy to revisit in 2020, especially on vinyl. Mark my words, people, Gabe Lee is already one of the most slept-on indie country acts of this past year, and yet his immediate appeal on performance and delivery makes him one of the easiest for me to recommend. This guy's going places, folks. You should hear him. Number 2. I'm shocked this album wound up so high on my list, because I don't really think it's better than his debut. I mean, it's close. It's only grown on me with a lot of repeated listens, and I do think they're very different projects. This is absolutely more consistent. They might be tough to compare, but this is an album that didn't quite blow people's minds like the debut did. But at the same time, call it either dirt emo or just plain indie country, Rustin Kelly knocked it out of the goddamn park.
If it hurts either way, what's the point in dragging it out? Let it fade on either side.
Now look, I I do get why some people might have been slower to embrace Shape and Destroy. It doesn't have the surging, climactic high points of Dying Star, even if the experimentation is often still really there, just nestled into the compositions and the subtler elements of production that show that Ruston Kelly is a far more innovative artist than he often gets credit. But really, that's also not the point of Shape and Destroy. Following in the wake of the debut, continuing that story, this is an album that shows Ruston Kelly finding real love, and then actually having to do the hard work to sustain and hold on to it, to keep it, which means that he has to confront his own vices, his own angst, and doing some of that quiet work that's way less flashy, even as he can't quite shake the feeling that it all might be for naught in the end, but it's still worth it? Maybe? The comparison I made at the time was to another album that's actually on this list, Chilombo by Jhené Aiko. And that's a weird comparison, I get it, but it fits. But also Ruston Kelly has to drill deeper, not just doing the work of self-care for his partner, but for himself. And there's such a core of hope and even optimism from him that keeps his album chugging forward to grow and build. And yeah, the divorce from Casey Musgraves does add a quiet sense of real tragedy in retrospect to a lot of the album, and you can tell he did not intend, but if anything, that only deepens the album's weight and deeper, subtler emotional appeal. And as such, it feels therapeutic. It lets you breathe deeply, confront your own very human failures, understand how they have shaped you, accept what you can't change, and destroy whatever you can. And for the sort of longer, more meditative moments, damn near the album that was my most surprising soundtrack of my 2020, but for one obvious exception, number 1. I mean, it wasn't gonna be anything else.
'Cause we're just so fucking tired of explaining ourselves. We throw a pill down our throats, or ourselves into the ocean. 'Cause half our friends are dead, the other half are depressed. In this budget rain line, the borderline's looking thin.
Let's not mince words here. With Brave Faces Everyone, Spanish Love Songs made one of the best pop punk and emo albums I think I've ever heard in my life. Impeccably produced, amazingly well-paced, melodically consistent to a fault, as I'm fairly certain that some people have noted that the majority of it all seems to be in the same damn key, and yet it sticks out because it's got enough visceral diversity in the grooves and the solos and the content so that every single song punches. And then there's Dylan Slocum's delivery, a righteous, shredded howl that leaves everything on the table with a bit of a post-hardcore tremble, and yet it's got a sense of raw catchiness that could go toe-to-toe with pretty much everyone in the genre. Hell, anyone in any genre. More importantly, though, he makes it seem real. It's immediate, and with this sort of content, that's the only way it could work. Racked in between a generational divide, drug addiction, depression, imposter syndrome, a genuine fear of what could be coming in societal collapse, and gross inequalities all around you that you don't think you can escape, all amidst a sense and an understanding of poverty and class that gives this band the sort of teeth that so many in their genre would never dare touch. It's all too much. And that's the point. This is an album that dares you to dismiss it ironically, or use your own privilege to deflect from its truth, because those are criticisms that the band has already weathered in facing reality, and they've come out stronger for it. They've come out the other side with some genuine urgency. So if there is a punk band that resonates more strongly in our times, especially for my generation, I'm not sure you can name one beyond Spanish Love Songs. Now, of course, the flip side to all of that is that being this raw and being this direct can be kind of genuinely hard to listen to, and I know peers who simply found it way too much. And I'll admit, there are points in 2020 where I thought that would be the same for me, and yet I would keep coming back to this. I'd keep coming back to the core of this album, where no matter how much the loser is going to get kicked and bloodied, and where self-destruction might be that sensible career choice, they don't give up. I mean, optimism might be the radical life choice on the other side, but it's the only one they can justify making to themselves. And for as much as this cuts so deep this year, by the end you're left with the hope that there might be a way out, that things could be fixed, that things could be made better. It's gonna be a long road, it's gonna be hard, it's gonna be deeply frustrating, but we have time. life is very long. We can get there. The apex point in staring in the face of Midwestern emo's ennui and coming out the side stronger for it. And look, I'm not one to make bold predictions, specifically around the word classic, but I will say this is probably going to be a cult touchstone in 5 years or less. It has that sort of transcendent power. Probably not the first time you've seen this on a list on YouTube, but here it is. Brave Faces Everyone by Spanish Love Songs. Best album of 2020. Let's see if 2021 ahead can find gems and match it. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yes, I know this list is late, but again, a lot to get through. I hope you all understand. And I hope you guys all have an opportunity to share the list in my comments down below. I'm sure there is at least several, probably plenty of differences. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to help support the channel, maybe get involved in my Discord server, add albums to my schedule for next year, link to my Patreon right over there. Again, I'll say it again, please do not feel obligated to do so, but if you want to, the option's available. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse. I'll see you more in the rest of 2021, and I'll see you next time.